Okay, hello everybody. Welcome to our latest guest speaker in our marketing speaker series. It's brought to you by the Rutgers Business School Master of Science in Digital Marketing program. I am Stacy Schwartz. I'm an RBS Rutgers Business School Marketing professor and the founding director of our MS in Digital Marketing program. Our program is a fully online, AACSB accredited, and it is our pleasure to bring you the latest thinking related to our increasingly digital and omni-channel world. Tonight, I have the pleasure of introducing Bryan Ruiz, who will be moderating an interactive conversation with tonight's fantastic guest speaker, Lamont Swittenberg, on the topic of branding in a digital world. Bryan Ruiz has been at Google for almost 10 years. He is currently a global strategy and operations team lead, but he spent the past 8 years in the sales organization, working with clients to build their brands through Google's suite of products, including YouTube and search. He has been teaching with our program, the Rutgers MS in Digital Marketing, for about 3 years now. He's been focused on our digital advertising and promotions course. But this spring semester, we're really looking forward to Bryan's launch of 2 new elective mini courses in our program. One is on performance marketing in a digital world, and the other is on branding in a digital world, which is apropos to our conversation that we're hosting today. When he isn't working or teaching, Bryan is spending time with his 2 toddlers, his partner, and his French bulldog. So Bryan, Lamont, welcome. And Bryan, I will turn the Zoom over to you.
Sounds good. Thank you, Stacy. And hello, everyone. I'm super excited to be here and chat about all things branding. I've had the opportunity to teach at Rutgers, as Stacy said, for the past 3 years, see some familiar faces and names. And for those who I don't know, I hope to meet you soon. Before we jump right in, feel free to put questions in the chat during the conversation, or we'll have a quick live Q&A at the end of our conversation for those who want to hold their questions to the very end. So without further ado, let me introduce Lamont Swittenberg. He is a seasoned marketing executive with over 25 years of experience in brand marketing and strategy. He currently serves as the SVP of marketing at Warner Music Group. However, fun fact, he just accepted the role and he's starting tomorrow. So hold all of your questions around Warner Music Group for our next live chat. But before this, he held leadership roles at Nielsen and Peacock, which is a division of NBC Universal. Lamont's earlier career included positions at PhD Media, Coca-Cola, Dr. Pepper 7-Up, Virgin Mobile, and Hewlett-Packard. He holds a BS in marketing from the University of Virginia and an MBA from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. In his free time, he enjoys blogging about music and pop culture and spending time with his family in Maplewood, New Jersey, which was amazing to connect with because we found out that we live probably 3 streets away from each other. So without further ado, hi, Lamont. How are you?
Hi, I'm doing well. Thanks. Thanks for the great intro as well.
Yeah, of course. Should we just jump right in?
Sure.
Awesome. So let's start with an easier one. Given your background in corporate and brand marketing at large global organizations like NBC Universal, can you share your perspective on the role of branding in today's world and what it means for a brand to go beyond its name and logo and become a valuable asset that represents a company's mission, value, and vision?
Yeah, I think that's a good place to jump in at. In today's world, which is increasingly more complex, with consumers more savvy and much more cynical than they ever used to be. I still believe that the branding is still incredibly instrumental to any company's success and any sort of brand or product service success. Because of all the complexity out there, it's still just it's the chief source of where all the value that if you're a company, everything you've created and everything you've done is sort of stored in this nebulous thing we call the brand. All of the awareness you've built, all of the goodwill, all the credibility, all the great customer service is all kind of stored in this place called brand, and it's really the chief source of your differentiation. It's the way you can stand out more than any other. Consumers, I think, are always looking for shortcuts. They're looking for quick answers. And one way you can do that is with your brand. So in a world of difficult choices that you're trying to make quickly, people still, even though they might not admit it, they rely on, they fall back on a differentiator called the brand. I like to use the example. I'm anyone who knows me knows I'm an addict for t-shirts, and I'm constantly bombarded because everyone knows that I'm looking for t-shirts. I'm constantly getting t-shirt ads as I'm surfing the web or on social media. And often I'm like, that's a cool shirt, but if it's from a brand that I don't know, I tend to be a little skeptical. But if I see the ads from, someone I like, Todd Snyder, for example, then I'm buying that t-shirt. So it's that kind of thing, quick shorthand, a source of value, source of credibility. So I think it's more important than ever. And the brands that the companies that do it well, that go beyond just sort of like hiring smart people and having smart messaging, really do a good job of sort of living their brand values every day and making it sort of the essence of what they do and the essence for decision making. I think making those tough decisions when they're not popular, when they're not trendy, when it's not necessarily going to deliver a short-term sort of sale or return on investment, but knowing that it's going to pay off in the long term. Those are the brands that really sort of go beyond that.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point. I think these brands, it takes a long time, right? And some of these legacy brands have decades to build it. And then kind of pivoting to our next question, a lot of these brands that are, legacy brands had to also change how they thought about branding, right? Because of the rise of digital, right? So how do you think the digital first nature of today's audiences has really changed the way brands have to approach building and maintaining their reputation that they work so hard, through the traditional outlets historically?
Yeah, I think it's, the biggest thing for me is just like remembering that, I think it was Seth Godin who said that like every interaction that you make with the consumer is part of branding, right? And so just remembering that like there's so many more touch points, but you can't think of like them as discrete. Consumers certainly don't distinguish between your retail presence or a traditional piece of advertising or out of home they've seen versus your own O&O channels or your social handles or anything you're doing to do digital marketing across the web. It all has to work together seamlessly. So I think just making sure you are consistent with that thinking and that messaging across all of those touch points is really the big difference. It's just, as marketers, you have so many more tools at your disposal. And so many more sort of touch points to orchestrate. That's really the big difference, and just making sure those things are humming along in this sort of harmonious blend. Because consumers are going to see you in all of those places. So I think that's really, other than that, it's kind of the same thing. You just keep adding to the toolbox and keep thinking of ways to make it all work together.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. I think, and when you talk about the toolbox, you need a big one, right? Because there's so many people now that you can access either online or via traditional. And I think that leads to like the next theme a little bit that I want to kind of double click on is around fragmentation, right? Because obviously brands are trying to reach everyone, especially some of those like larger, like Coca-Cola and these brands that, everyone with a mouth and, it's just those kind of brands, especially where you're going with music. It's how do you cast a wide net? But can you provide some examples of brands that have successfully adapted to the challenges posed by today's fragmentation, distracted audiences, and kind of what strategies have they employed?
Yeah, it's something that's really near and dear to me from the media business. So working in at first at NBC Universal, I worked on a traditional kind of cable network side. Before moving to streaming with Peacock. And, it's no secret if you work on a traditional kind of cable brand that, the way people are consuming media changed rapidly over the last, 5 to 10 years with sort of linear viewing increasingly going down. And so, looking at some brands in that space was really interesting for me. One that pops to mind that I thought of in prepping for this was the NBA, right? A lot of sports brands have done really well. The NBA, for example, sort of started to understand that like not as many, particularly with Gen Z, were kind of sitting around doing appointment viewing, watching their 82 games a year. They started to understand that like actually people consume sports, in particular something like the NBA, in small chunks. They're getting the highlights the next day, and I just love the way they adapted to that formula. If you follow the NBA on TikTok, for example, you'll see that they have such a beautiful personality, the way they understand the audience, the way they deliver short form content about last night's games. It's slightly different from what they do on Instagram, where they're giving you sort of fun clips from the game last night. They're always showing the outfits the players wore to the game, things like that. So it's just a really smart way that they've adapted to fragmentation, understanding that, like, hey, no one's going to watch a game for 2 hours on a Tuesday night, but they're certainly going to pick up the highlights. And a lot of brands have sort of made that sort of shift really nicely that I've seen. Particularly again, some sports brands, the US Open, if you guys were watching the summer, did a really nice job of the way they used digital media to promote the US Open and to get people involved. Again, they had a very specific personality depending on the medium. They talked to the audience as if they were fans of tennis and not just sort of like reporters giving you the news. So a lot of it is about just sort of the way good brands understand the medium and then sort of have adapted to that, I think.
Yeah. I think it's interesting too that you bring up like NBA on TikTok and on Instagram, because it feels like though that brand is really putting their all into fit for platform, right? And that's not easy. And so in the world of fragmentation, like building for platform really kind of breaks through that noise a little bit. And, a lot of brands get it right and many get it wrong. Especially on the YouTube side, I know that a lot of brands will just throw a TV commercial up on the platform and hope it works. And it's just a different audience and the consumption is very different.
Yeah, I've seen that a lot. I do it often where I'll check just to see, what a brand is posted on one site, on a Tuesday morning or whatever. And then if I click on, Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, IG, and I see like, oh, it's actually the same exact thing. It's always like, oh, they're not trying very hard to adapt to it.
Yeah. Yeah, 100%. And that, that also leads into like this highly transactional marketplace, right? Consumers are bombarded with so many messages. You mentioned your t-shirt, love, and you're probably getting so many different brands that you may not even know are now all of a sudden contacting you. And so it's probably hitting you 24/7 across all your screens and devices. And so what can brands do to build and maintain that long-term consumer loyalty in this space?
Yeah, it's a good one. It's not easy because again, you're talking about long-term investments, often don't pay off right away. But I think there's a couple things. One is there's certainly some sort of customer loyalty things you can do, particularly in a digital space. And I think brands can and should do those things, like loyalty programs, rewards programs, points programs, any kind of gamification efforts, putting together sort of special sales incentives and if you're a retail brand doing sales, but sort of theming those things are all good. And they do generate loyalty. They keep people coming back, but they're transactional in nature. Nonetheless, I think some of the longer term, more difficult things are about, using digital platforms to have a conversation with your audience, right? Thinking about getting feedback when there's customer service issues. I love brands who aren't afraid to step in and say, hey, sorry, be culpa, we'll make up for that, or here's someone you can contact. So having that dialogue, soliciting feedback. Another thing I think is really important is to remember the 80-20 rule, which is great for loyalty. So understanding that what you really have to do is super serve your biggest fans. I'm new to the music business, but I know that sort of super fans is a big deal in the business, and something that is going to be ramping up a lot, with this understanding that in many cases the bulk of your business is coming from the most important consumers. And so using that lens to make sure you're super serving that group in every way you can is another way to build long-term loyalty, and then trying to cultivate the other group up to become either if not super fans, at least heavy fans of your brand.
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, you touched a couple of really interesting points. First is all around engagement. So like building for engagement, not just simply throwing your message out there, but then also like your customer service example is really interesting because it's all around building a persona, right? Your brand now can be engaged with. right? And, I know I've yelled at some airlines on Twitter back in the day, and they responded though. And that it gives you a sense of like, okay, I feel like I'm being heard, and it
Yeah.
builds some level of connection, which is really interesting.
Yeah, for sure. And I think the more that brands are empowering, people to sort of make those decisions and sort of be able to help a customer or not being afraid to kind of wade into a conversation. If you've set good guidelines and given people again a set of values to act on, and said as long as you're consistent with those values, feel free to step in. I think it works really well.
Yeah. And then the last point you touched upon was really just building that cohort of your super fans. Because at the end of the day, like we're talking about digital and branding and how it's changed, but that's still very fundamental to how it's been for the last few decades, like word of mouth. Find the people that really love your brand and they'll help you, right? And I think that's super important for people to understand that some of these foundational things still hold true today. It's just how do you re-engage them or engage them in a different way on these platforms than you historically have.
Yeah, for sure. Those evangelists are the best marketers you could have. Again, from the media business, we always knew that. Like if we were launching a show that was based on a piece of IP, whether a video game or a book, the first thing we think about are the people who are fans of that IP. Because if you don't make those folks happy, if you get something wrong, then you're dead in the water from the very start. So you have to sort of start with the super fans and sort of build out from there.
Yeah, definitely. As an instructor, I know it's almost hard to teach digital courses because the world is changing. The speed is so quick. And so it's so hard to keep everything so updated, right? Like even working at Google, like whenever I feel comfortable with our products, we change them. So with the rapid evolution of technology and communication channels, like how can brands effectively keep up with this marketplace to stay relevant and resonate with these target audiences?
Yeah, it's a real challenge, particularly with things kind of moving at the speed of light. But yeah, I mean, I know we talked a little bit in prep for this about this idea of being willing to test and try new things. And I know a lot of companies will say, this idea of not sort of worrying too much about failure. Some people will, some companies, will say that and then don't back it up. But the best are right, they have this idea of like, hey, we're bound to make mistakes. The mistakes are, they're going to come with moving fast. They're going to come with taking some risks, and it's okay. As long as we fail fast, we learn from it, and we move on. So I think that's a big piece of it. If possible, it doesn't always work, but trying to carve out some money, every year to say like, hey, we're going to have 5% of the budget set aside to take some risks, bet on some things that are coming in the future, making sure we're engaging with the latest tools and technologies, the latest digital ad platforms or digital ad products, things like that we're trying out. We're trying to see if we can optimize them, learn from them, and kind of move on. That's one of the big ways I think that work in terms of trying to keep up.
Yeah, I think from my experience too, testing and learning is so important. Especially at Google, we say a lot, fail fast. Because if you don't fail fast and if you wait too long, everything that you're trying to do is going to be dated already. And so it's really important to move at speed and try it out quickly and see if it works for your brand. If not, keep it going. But if not, you're going to miss out. So yeah, I agree.
Yeah, and the other thing is just to sort of be, sort of constantly listening, monitoring, tracking, testing. Again, getting that feedback loop, looking at what your competitors are doing, just sort of like just being like a sponge for everything that's going on in culture and technology, sort of starting every day with like, what's out there, what's new, what do we need to keep our eye on, how are we doing, how are we being perceived, what are people saying on social. All of those things are just so important in terms of at least being in the know and sort of having that finger on the pulse.
Yeah, I think people forget how easy it is to find competitor information, right?
Yeah.
Like I know a little bit like on search, right? I teach search, and students are like, well, what should I write on my search ads? Well, search your keywords and see what your competitors are saying, right? Like it's right there for you.
Yeah.
And I think there's a Facebook ads library. You type in a brand, you can see all the ads they're currently running on Facebook and Instagram. So like there's so many of these free resources out there that students can and professionals can take advantage of, to your point, just to get that intel and make decisions quicker. So
for sure.
Pivoting over to one of my favorite topics, creative. again, we talked about it a little bit earlier around, made for platform and all of those. So in your view, what role does storytelling play in creating a strong brand presence identity? And how can brands craft creative narratives to engage with their audiences in this, very oversaturated area where we're getting ads left and right all the time?
Yeah, I think it goes back to where we started, right? It's, if you want to cut through the clutter, if you want to stand out, there's so much science now that sort of proves that storytelling is the best way to make sure that you are what you say is going to be remembered, that you're going to make an emotional connection with the consumer, or if you're just having a one-on-one conversation with somebody, they're so much more likely to remember. And to literally, science has shown that people are literally on the same wavelength. So when you're listening to someone tell a story, your brain tends to sort of slow down or speed up, depending on the storyteller, as you become immersed in that story. So with that proof in mind, it's so important to sort of think through how can we sort of create an origin story, a hero's journey, something for everything we're selling, for every message we're putting out there. How do we think about, like when I'm doing presentations, when I'm trying to pitch for a new budget or sell a new campaign, I always think about like, okay, I'm going to open this presentation with an incredible cold open. It's going to be funny. It's going to be scary. It's going to be shocking, but I'm going to have a Saturday Night Live style cold open. And then I'm going to sort of move into the main body of the presentation. That's always going to be based on some pain point. It could be based on an opportunity, but often on like, here's a pain point that we're all suffering from. Get everybody head nodding and like, yes, that is a pain point as a consumer that we need to deal with. And then just sort of, move from there to like, here's the solution, here's the reasons to believe, and always end with like, and here's the call to action, here's the takeaway, here's what we need to do. We need to go take that mountain. But I think the brands that are doing that, who are really just sort of like thinking about like, what's our, sort of unique and compelling story that we can put around this, are the ones that are excelling. It's everything. I mean, I think I saw some stats recently that this is a good test. It says that within 1 hour you forget 50% of what someone told you. Within 1 day it's more like 70%, and then in 1 week it's like 90%. So the human brain is just not built to remember a lot of facts, but we're wired to remember stories.
Yeah, especially because we're getting so many of them. I need to kind of break through. I might actually ask one of the student questions because I think it dovetails into creative nicely. And so Tumomi actually asked, thank you for the presentation. I have a question. I think consistent messaging across all the channels are important, but at the same time, each persona has different objections and needs different message needs. How can we make them coexist well?
So it's a good question. When I'm building a campaign or launching a product, whatever it may be, we try to create a messaging hierarchy, some kind of messaging matrix, right? That talks about like, here's the core message we're trying to deliver. And that core message shouldn't actually change across mediums, right? So if you think about like, here's a product that we make. This is a product that solves this particular pain point. Here's what's unique and compelling about it, right? This is what makes it different. And this is why it actually is going to work to solve that pain point. That core message should be consistent. So if that's what you should do consistently. And then everything else is about the delivery vehicle, right? That's where you're sort of tweaking the tone, or you might be more humorous, you might be more serious. You understanding, sort of when and where you're talking and what's going on in culture and what's going on in the world. So you're tweaking like tone and style, but the message you're delivering is it shouldn't be changing, and it shouldn't even be changing dramatically if you think the audience is changing, right? I think it's a misnomer to think it's more important to know the audience. It's actually more important to know your product. It's more important to know what we believe is unique and compelling about the product, and keep delivering that. Again, small tweaks on style and things like that when you're thinking about like what platform it's going to be and what the environment is.
I absolutely love that. you're never going to catch up with all the audiences, but if you know your brand and you stick with that, like that'll grow. And I think that's such a great point. Nancy asked, and I'm not sure if this might be a follow-up, but do we have a list of archetypal story types that you use as reference when creating a brand story?
Yeah, I mean, I somewhere along the line, I can't remember when I came to the hero's journey very late. Somehow I didn't pick it up until I got into corporate, but
Yep.
that's the one that we always came back to a lot, and I use all the time at at NBC Universal, and then sort of copied that and sort of use that sort of architecture for the storytelling. Again, sort of opening with sort of a pain point and sort of building from there, and sort of thinking about like a story that has a beginning, a middle, and end, always thinking with the end in mind before you start. But that's sort of the big archetype that I use.
Yeah, no, I agree. That's definitely like a powerful one. Pivoting over, because I know you spend a good amount of time at Nielsen, so we can't not talk about data and measurement. That data and analytics are essential to a modern marketing landscape, especially to understand like what's working and what isn't, and what's resonating. So how can brands leverage data to better understand their audience and make data-driven decisions to enhance their brand's relevance?
Yeah, I mean, just like we're saying that, every we can't think of different touch points, whether they be digital or traditional or social, or whatever they are, sort of like discrete. They all work together. I think it's the same way with like data and storytelling. So storytelling can sound esoteric and emotional connections and a hero's journey, but those don't mean nothing if you're not using data to think about like what message you're trying to deliver, what story you're trying to tell, what action you need consumers to take at the end of the day. What are you actually selling? How's the company going to make some money? And that's where the data comes in, and it doesn't take away from the story. It lends credibility, right? Everyone always talks about reasons to believe, and sort of making sure that yes, the emotional brain is key for getting things to remember and stick, but the rational brain won't go there unless you prove it, unless you have some reasons to believe, unless you have some data to back it up. And so within that esoteric hero's journey, delivering the data, right, and understanding what story you're trying to tell is it actually enhances rather than detracts. So for example, one of my favorite sort of use of data-driven storytelling is again going back to the streaming world, right? We used to market a new television show by thinking about who's the audience for it, and as much as we used information, it still was a lot of like sort of predictive information, sort of like looking at like, oh, this show seems to be a lot like that show, and like who watched that show? Oh, that's probably going to be adult males between the age of X, Y, and Z. And we build these demographic profiles based on that. And then heaven forbid, we would take it a step further and build these like personas and say like, oh, this is a guy who drinks beer and, likes to sit around on, his Saturdays watching football. What we got to once we moved to the streaming world was actual data to understand the audience. So we could actually look at what people were watching, and then just market the shows to the people who are watching it and not have to worry about like what their demographic profile was, because we had actual data. So that was fascinating, because you could see that it could be a 14-year-old girl in Idaho and a 57-year-old male in China, and they tend to watch the same thing. So you got to know that like, my favorite saying based on that was it's not what you're like, is what you like. And so we started marketing shows to people who liked it. Like, I don't care what your demographic profile is. Now I have actual data to know what people are watching. And we had these clusters of audiences that we could market shows to, which is really fascinating. And I said, again, that's a great example of data-driven decision making. Another quick one I'd love to throw in is Spotify. I think the Spotify Wrapped, which got so many accolades. If everyone's not familiar, at the end of the year, Spotify sends you a beautiful little story about all your favorite artists and all the music you listen to throughout the year, and it feels very beautiful. It makes you feel warm and fuzzy, and that's all based on them using their data to know what you're listening to. It's sort of again a brilliant use of marrying data and storytelling together.
Yeah, no, I think it's so true, and it's come such a long way. I remember when I was at Disney, we got 3 requests for proposals from P&G, one for Swiffer, one for Bounty, and one for Tide. And every single persona was slightly different, even though it's solving for the same person. But every single brand had to have their own persona. No one could have the exact same persona, even though the same person is probably buying all 3 brands. So I think it's great to use data to actually make better informed decisions on that.
Yeah, I probably annoy people a lot because I don't have tons of patience for personas these days, because I'm just like, it doesn't matter. What are
It's
people
true.
actually doing? Yeah.
I love it. Obviously digital moves quick, right? And as much good as it can be, there can always be some bad that happens, and brands need to pivot and be quick. And so brands often face crisis and challenges, especially when they're across platforms 24/7. And so it's a lot to keep up with. So how should a brand's value and mission guide its response in crises? And how can these experiences impact long-term brand sustainability?
Yeah, so for that one, there's certainly no easy answers. There's no sort of right and wrong way to approach it. It takes some amazing PR professionals to sort of deal with these things. And if you ask 10 people, you'll probably get 10 different answers. I can tell you what I've tried to do recently. Again, it hasn't always worked, because sometimes it's just hard. It's one of those things where you often go into it knowing that you're going to make some people unhappy. It might be a 50-50 split of your customer base. It might be your employees, but you're often having to make those kinds of crisis decisions. And so, what I've tried to do lately, right, is create sort of a predetermined decision matrix of like, okay, based on our brand values, here's what we're going to do in situation X. Here's how we recover, or here's, if there's a political situation, like the one we're in now, with the conflict in the Middle East, you sort of predetermine how we're going to respond and try to make that determination based on a few factors. One of which is certainly, how does this sync up with our stated corporate values? Another one being, how relevant is this to our business, to our customers, to our employees? And so we had like 5 of those criteria, and we would score the issue based on those things to decide how to react. Again, we often didn't follow it because you might get a score of like, this is an 8 and therefore we should do this, but someone might still say like, oof, that doesn't feel right. But at least it gives you some place to start, right? To say like, these are our values and this is we stick to them. The other is just having a few principles. One being that like, if you are able to sort of always respond based on values, it just makes it a lot easier. It makes you a lot more consistent. It makes you look a lot more authentic. You don't want to sort of wait and hedge and say like, well, let's see what the other brands are doing. That always makes you look inauthentic and slow, and everyone sniffs it out. Again, the employee base is always so important, and they're the ones who are always going to sniff that out if you try to take that approach. So you just try to be consistent and to act according to some pre-established values. Try to have the team in place who's going to make these decisions. The smaller that circle, the better. But these 4 or 5 people know they're the ones on call, no matter when, no matter what time. And those 4 or 5 people are empowered to make a call. It doesn't necessarily need to be the CEO or chairman. Because again, the higher it has to go, the slower those things tend to be, the more tightly crafted the wording needs to be, and all of those kinds of things. So I don't know if that's a great answer. It's such a gray and difficult area, but trying to sort of predetermine how you're going to act, having a small circle, acting according to values, and being consistent, being the most important thing. One other quick thing to add on that, which I think is really important. I don't know if folks saw in the journal just a couple of weeks ago, the sort of like consumer desire for brands to speak out to sort of weigh in on social political issues is actually down considerably. It's sort of like peaked in 2020 with all the issues that were going on, and since then, consumers have actually backed off of that. So there's not as much pressure now to speak out, and more consumers are saying like, you know what, can you make a good product? Can you not pollute the environment? Can you treat your employees well? That's what we need you to do. We don't actually need as much of you to sort of be weighing in on political issues or social issues and things like that. So just an interesting thought to keep in mind.
Yeah, no, I think it's interesting. I think first you mentioned all around planning. Brands that plan pretty much expecting it to happen are the ones that are better off when it does happen. And then also speed. I agree. It's when there's brands that hold back and others move forward, you end up looking like a copycat once you finally do come out with any sort of statement. So yeah, I think, and the speed thing's interesting. This is more of a lighthearted example, but like I believe it was a Super Bowl 2 or 3 years ago when it went dark, they lost their power, and then Oreo did a great execution on social media around it and just got in front of that crisis and said, let's just use it as an opportunity to brand and, make it a moment. And so they turned something that was kind of negative, not as bad as like some of these other moments that we discussed, but still a moment that they took they were planning for some of these things to happen and they just capitalized on it very quickly. So it's authentic.
Yeah, and it had to be a case where whoever did that felt really empowered to act, right? If they had to go through layers of approvals and it never would come off. That was a group that felt confident that they could act and that they would be supported.
Yeah, no, I love it. Before we get to the last question, I maybe want to take a couple of questions. Is that okay?
Sure. Yeah.
Perfect. So we have one in the chat, and then after that, we'll open it up to anyone that wants to raise their hand. But Tamora asked, as the use of AI increases, what do you think AI does to brand credibility and storytelling when people are not sure if they're talking to a human or a machine?
Ooh, boy, tough one. I don't know about the credibility part, because I think the way I'm thinking about AI and especially going into the music business, which is probably going to be most impacted early on by this technology, is just thinking about like how do we leverage it as a creative tool? How do we use it rather than being afraid of it? How do we leverage it? How do we use it to supercharge creativity, marketing efforts, all of those kinds of things. And so if humans, one way or another, are going to be behind it, and even if it's just putting in the right prompts or thinking of incredibly genius ways to use this technology, I think that's all good. And I think people will just be, just generally be delighted if we're doing delightful things with it. But if you're just saying like, hey, I don't need a copywriter anymore because AI can write copy for me, maybe that starts to get like, you start to lose credibility, and it sort of like becomes, sort of like open for cynicism. But if you're using it to do something delightful that we've never seen before, that like frees up our minds, if say like, hey, we can let AI write automated emails for us, but that just frees up my brain to think about something else even more creative. I think it's all good.
Yeah, definitely. Does anyone else have any questions? They want to raise their hand, come off mute, ask live.
I have a question.
Of course.
Hey, Lamont, how are you?
Good.
Great talk.
Oh, thanks. Nancy. Hi.
So Lamont and I used to work together. I have a question. I love that line that you said where, I care what you like. And it could be the 12-year-old girl in Wyoming and the 57-year-old man in China. But what about all those industries where the creator of the product doesn't necessarily have access to the data because there's a distributor in between? So I'm thinking about maybe book publishers or manufacturers of med tech devices, where they just don't really know who the end users are. In that case, do you resort to personas, or how do you think about segmenting the market when there's less data?
Yeah, I think in that case, right? Yeah, again, um, when I pick on personas, I mean like when people take them too far, right? When they start inventing this very specific person who needs this device. The truth of the matter is like it seems unnecessary to get that specific, right? Because people will always have different needs. They'll come from different backgrounds. It just seems unnecessary to go that far. But yeah, using what you know to build profiles and to segment your audience, even if you don't have sort of the treasure trove of information that a streamer is sitting on, it's still fair game, right? And still, in those cases to use third-party surveys and use different ways to kind of get at the intelligence around your audience, and then using that as your modeling for the audience and what their pain points are, what the opportunities are, what they're looking for next. Is fair game. So yeah, it's certainly is easier and becoming increasingly easy to get at data in a digital world. If you've got customers on your social platform and you're able to track them from an event, and you've got emails, there's so many ways to get at real data that I feel like you can rely less and less on sort of trying to like extract and model out a very specific persona, if that helps.
Yeah, great, thank you.
Anyone else? Don't be shy. Come off mute. It's Monday. We understand. Yes, Lorena, there will be a recording. So I guess, Lamont, maybe we can close out with our final question. So, you talked a lot about branding. We talked about many different areas. You've had a long career in it. What advice might you have for anyone on this call that's thinking about either starting their career in marketing and branding, or just want to go deeper into their career around this world? Like, what advice do you have for everyone on the call today?
So yeah, I mean, I think a couple of things. One, starting from this base of digital marketing where you guys are is great. You all probably know a lot more about digital marketing and data-driven marketing than I do, coming at it, from the other way of trying to learn it on the fly. So I think that's great. I think the thing I always say is, especially if you're starting out or you're trying to make a transition, building your portfolio, right? And that doesn't mean like literally, building out a physical or digital portfolio, but thinking about all the things you've done that you can sort of tout and tell a story around, going back to that term about like, hey, these are things that I've done that have been great marketing, even though I might not have a marketing title. Here's an example of when I crafted an audience profile, or I worked on X, Y, and Z, and it fits perfectly with the role that I'm going for. So building those things, taking note of them, crafting them into stories, and crafting them into the successes that you've had on a bottom line is key. Going back to, again, just sort of like demonstrating that passion you have. So like just immersing yourself, in what's going on in marketing. What are the latest trends? How are brands using AI? What is the future of having some hot take on how AI is going to impact branding is really good, right? Or just like, what's the latest technology? Immersing in just like all over pop culture. Like, so it's I feel like increasingly I have to get up an hour early to just read everything that's going on in pop culture and what happened at the Chiefs game yesterday with Taylor, as well as then transitioning and say like what's going on with the trades and what's going on in marketing. But like all of those things just sort of like, one, just make you really smart, and also just again demonstrate that like this person's super into it. And so because you're trying to make that case that like I may not check all the boxes of the traditional stuff you'd be looking to, but I check 5 or 6 of them, and the rest of it I'm going to make up on passion and ingenuity and resourcefulness, that kind of thing. So I think those are key. And then of course the cliche sort of like building connections, I hate to use the word network, but making connections, getting to know the right people, sort of planting seeds. and just making sure that when the moment comes that you're able to sort of like say, hey, remember me, that kind of thing.
I love it. Well, thank you, Lamont, for your time. We know you need to get to bed since starting your job tomorrow. We're all
That's right.
thinking about you and excited for you. Thank you for your time. Really appreciate your insight and being so open. And yeah, thank you everyone for joining, and have an amazing night.
Thank you, guys.